Hello, everyone. My name is Buvia Yulin, and I'm the director for SCMA. I just want to remind you that this event is in webinar format. That means you can see and hear our presenters, but they cannot hear or see you. This webinar is eligible for 1 hour of MCLE credit and 1 hour of MC3 continuing education credit. If you're requiring MCLE credit for attending this event, please make sure that the account you use to sign in and the name that is displayed for you during the webinar is a name that matches your state bar. If you did not provide us with your state bar during registration, please email us. If you have any questions, our email address is info@scmediation.org. Now I'll turn it over to SCMA President Mark Lemke.
All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining. I have the privilege of serving as 2021's SCMA President. SCMA is the premier organization dedicated to the advancement of the mediation practice and profession. We'd encourage any of you looking for a mediator to approach our qualified panelists today, or to take a look at our website, scmediation.org, where we do offer a select a mediator directory. As a reminder, as a thank you to each of you for attending, you will be applicable to qualify for a discounted membership for your first year, and you should have already gotten that information from our director, Bouvier, who you just spoke with. Wanted to introduce and thank the Attorney Outreach Committee. Let me turn it over to James Cameron. Jim.
Mark, thank you so much. Bouvier, thank you, and welcome everyone. I'm Jim Cameron. I'm the co-chair of the Attorney Outreach Committee for SCMA. We're delighted to have so many of you join us today for our first program of this new 2021 year, entitled Online Mediation 2.1, Beyond Intro to Zoom, Making the Best of Online Mediation in 2021. We have two outstanding panelists whom I will introduce to you shortly for their enlightened thoughts about what we've learned over the past year. First, I just want to mention that SCMA's Attorney Outreach Committee has a goal, and that goal is to provide education about mediation to members specifically of the legal profession. For those of you who are attending today who are not mediators, but either litigators or other members of the legal community, welcome. We're here to make this a friendlier and more informed form of dispute resolution for you. Mediation can and should be a very effective and valuable tool for problem solving, not just for attorneys, but also their clients as well. I want to mention a couple of preliminary things, but first, I'd ask each of you to think back to this past February. Whether you were an attorney or a mediator, your professional life was continuing pretty much per normal at that point. You were going to court for hearings and trials, and you were participating in mediation in someone's conference room, and so forth. Then came March, and in a heartbeat, everything came to a screeching halt. After a lengthy pause, while people figured out what on earth they were going to do, mediators as well as lawyers came to understand that they had to start improvising. All of a sudden, we all had to become fluent in Zoom if we were going to continue our work. So now here we are some 10.5 months later. What have we learned over this time? That's what we're going to discuss over the course of this hour. As for a couple of housekeeping things, first, you have the ability to submit questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please submit them in writing there, and we will be reviewing them over the course of the hour and will address them at the end of the program. We're planning to have the formal program end right around 1 o'clock, and we'll go a little bit past 1 in order to answer questions for those of you who can stay with us for that extra time. The other thing is you all should have received in your email the written materials for this webinar. It includes 4 published articles, 3 of them by Jan Shaw, one of our 2 panelists, and the other from Jennifer Johnston Toronto that was originally published in the Valley Bar magazine. In addition, She's also an SCMA board member and member of the Attorney Outreach Committee. The materials also include a compendium of the California Evidence Code sections, which govern the confidentiality of mediation. And that was kindly prepared by none other than our president of SCMA, Mark Lemke. So thanks to Mark, thanks to Jennifer, and thanks to Jan for your written materials. Now, for our panelists, we have two of LA's finest practitioners here to enlighten us today. One is an accomplished civil litigator and a leader of the bar, and the other one of the country's top employment mediators and arbitrators, and one of California's top neutrals in any discipline. And we truly are honored to have them both with us today. Let me first introduce Gretchen Nelson to you. Gretchen is well known throughout California as an accomplished class action litigation specialist who focuses her practice on the representation of plaintiffs in securities fraud and antitrust litigation. She's a founding partner of Nelson and Frankel LLP here in Los Angeles and has been extremely active in both Los Angeles and state bar activities throughout her distinguished career. She has served on the Board of Trustees and as the trustees' first treasurer of the State Bar of California. She also served as the president of the LA County Bar and chaired its litigation section. Gretchen also is an emeritus member of the board of directors of the Consumer Attorneys of Los Angeles. As a practitioner, Gretchen has achieved significant successes in major class action litigation, such as the ZZZZ Best securities fraud cases and In Re Compact Disc antitrust litigation, among many others. Of late, she also has started to tackle the multitude of problems plaguing the cruise line industry, whether problems with COVID, the flu, Legionnaire's disease, or other pervasive conditions on board certain vessels. So Gretchen, it's an honor and privilege to have you here. We welcome you and thank you. Let me now introduce Jan Frankel Shaw to you. Jan Frankel Shaw is widely recognized as one of Southern California's preeminent mediators, as well as a prolific author and widely respected educator in the field of alternative dispute resolution. Jan is a panel member neutral for ADR services here in LA. She serves as an appointed member of the mediation panel for the Central District of California, as well as a civil service hearing officer for the City and County of Los Angeles and LA Unified School District. Jan has been named a top 50 neutral by the Daily Journal, and has been inducted as a distinguished fellow of the prestigious International Academy of Mediators. She also has been named as one of California's super lawyers for the past 12 years. Jan is a past president of SCMA and participates in contributing regularly to its activities, which we appreciate very much. Excuse me one second. I also value Jan very much as a friend, a colleague, and an inspiring mentor. So Jan, as always, it's an honor and privilege to have you here. Welcome back, and thank you as always. So let's begin the program with a consideration of what we've learned about the benefits and drawbacks of virtual or online mediation since the onset of COVID last March. And Jan, let me start with you. Why don't you kick us off? What have we learned in your view?
First, I had to figure out how to unmute. Thank you for that kind introduction. It is, I will say, Zoom, one of the things I love is that you can see everybody. And I see that we have 90 participants, but I can't see any of your faces except Jim's and Gretchen's. So, forgive me if I'm talking to a kind of empty room, but hopefully these stories will be kind of instructive. So let me take you back. As Jim said, in February, we were merrily along doing our regular practice. And so I had a case scheduled for March 23rd at our Century City office. And on March 20th, our office closed. So we called them and let them know that the office was closing. We could not accommodate it. And what did they want to do? Initially, they said they did not want to go online and do a dispute resolution online. And ultimately, as the news kept tumbling and we kept seeing that it might not reopen for a month or two, that back in the day, they decided to go ahead with it. It was a disability discrimination case. As Jim said, I do primarily employment. And the issues, and I'm trying to muddy up the facts because Mark Lemke wanted to record this. So if you think you recognize this case, pretend it's fictional, but it is based on a real case, as all of the stories that I tell will be today. So it was a woman who had an ankle injury and she had been working from home. Isn't that a quaint recollection? And they said after she was returned to work, after she was no longer disabled, that she needed to come back to work at least once a week for a meeting. It was a production studio, a movie studio. And she refused, claiming that it was disability discrimination, that she really still hurt in her ankle and that it was a huge inconvenience to come. And she was able to do everything that she was supposed to be doing remotely anyways. And so they fired her. And she had a pretty decent discrimination case. She had filed with the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, but had not yet filed a lawsuit. Now remember, this was on March 23rd. So what I learned was we could figure out a way to do this remotely, and that the HR person, who was the defense client, was there, and she was also engaged in laying off no less than 500 people that day because the studio had been closed too by the Los Angeles County. Back at that point, it was just county by county closing, and we had no idea how temporary or how long-term it would be. But she was completely distracted. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, we didn't settle the case that day, but the lawyer and I stayed in touch with one another and settled it within the week. The benefit, the bonus of doing it online was that because of the confidentiality, it didn't have to set a precedent for how they were selecting for layoffs. Because of the urgency of what was going on in the business, it didn't have to distract or derail the company from a lawsuit that got there first, because she would have filed had she not been able to settle. And because of the industry and everybody going home, this young woman had a little bit of going forward, a little bit of runway, so to speak. It's a little bit of a bad metaphor in a person that had a broken ankle, but nonetheless had a little bit of a runway to go forward. So it was a learning lesson for all of us, but it was one that stuck with me because of the emerging issues that were going on in the business and with this individual and with the individual that was representing the defense.
Very cool. Gretchen, how about things from the litigation aspect? What have you learned over the course of these 10.5 months about online mediation, pros and cons?
So I guess let me start where Jan started, and thank you also, Jim, for that very kind introduction. This is what I think I've learned. We started off closing our office for 2 weeks, thinking that's all it was going to be. That segued to a month, that segued to another month. And what I think we all discovered is there's no knowing what's going to happen month to month. I think the first thing that became fairly clear to me was that trials weren't going to be happening anytime soon. Cases were stuck. Actually, the LA Superior Court, as many know, was closed from March 16th until June 22nd or something like that. Cases stacked up, orders stacked up, trials didn't go. Local bar groups began to jump in. San Diego Bar Association set up a program for trying to kind of obviate some of the problems by setting up mediation. Clients were hurting, companies were hurting. As you mentioned, I do a fair amount of maritime work, suing cruise lines. The cruise lines came to a grinding halt. No ships were sailing. No one was going out. Everyone was hemorrhaging money right, left, and center. And I think the takeaway for all of you is that really one of the primary ways to keep a case moving along is to try to see if you can't get into mediation. That means that you have to work to try to get your case into some method of being prepared to be mediated, which requires some work, but there also are alternatives that can be utilized to try to advance the case on both sides. I do think that for some companies, it's almost impossible. We had a case that we were trying to get settled and had a mediation in Las Vegas in January, and we're on track to get it resolved. And it fell apart entirely because the cruise line basically said, we're not paying any money. And ultimately, we wound up resurrecting it later in the year. So you have to kind of stick with it and keep going. But the client's expectations became, the clients were hurting too. One client was about to lose her house. They were desperate. So we got it resolved. But those are all the drivers in many respects for mediation that I think mediators need to recognize and understand. And in this alternative universe of Hollywood squares that we're living in right now, those things have got to come to into reality. People, everyone, both sides need to recognize it, and the mediators need to recognize it.
Great. Thank you so much, Gretchen. We're now going to switch over to a bunch of practical pointers, particularly for the legal practitioners here present with us. How you can use online mediation to your best advantage, given that it is the option right now. And I want to introduce the topic by perhaps stating the obvious, which is that you as attorneys need to be fully conversant about how Zoom works. And you also have to make sure that your client is comfortable with it. In my experience, we spend too much time dealing with just getting someone's signal right, or no, you weren't supposed to be logging in from Starbucks. You're supposed to be in a quiet place, even though you've covered it all in advance. So there's an obligation on the part of counsel to make sure the clients are fully ready for mediation, given that we're now Zooming rather than meeting in conference rooms. But there also are many subtler things that can enhance the experience through proper preparation. And we're going to start with the preparation for Zoom mediation. And Gretchen, I'll start with you on this one. You're an accomplished civil litigator. What do you recommend to your colleagues about preparing yourself and your clients for the mediation?
So this probably, in my view, is one of the portions of this program that is going to give you, in my view, the most practical pointers. Hopefully there are things that I've done, that I've learned, that people can learn from. But it's a combination of a variety of things. It takes a lot more preparation, in my view, to do a Zoom mediation than it does to do one in person. First off, for all of us, we're only two-dimensional. And in reality, people are three-dimensional. And so much of the cues that you get come from not just facial expressions, but body expressions, and those don't come across as well on a two-dimensional, as I said, Hollywood square format. And clients are uncomfortable with it. There's a reason that not everyone is a major movie star. Some people are good on camera and some people are not very good on camera. And so you have to, and that's true for the mediators, that's true for clients, it's true for the lawyers. I can't tell you how many times I am on some kind of Zoom thing and all I'm seeing is a person's head. I keep thinking, does that person not know that all I'm seeing is the top of their head? So let me start with the clients. I usually spend at least 2 to 3 hours with the clients on a Zoom format before the mediation to prepare them, explaining the practical side of things, not just the gestalt of the mediation itself and what the process is and the negotiating part, just on what do you look like? And boy, they don't sometimes get it. You can tell them 20 times. It's like you're going to court, but they still show up in t-shirts and Hawaiian shirts. And you sit there thinking, what part of this part did you not get when I said it? I have actually said to them, could you go out and get a better shirt on? I also have to talk to them about where they're going to be. I try to set up an alternative universe for them in a conference room where they can go and do it as opposed to doing it in their home. Let me say, doing it in your home can be helpful. It can be hurtful. If you're dying for money and you got nothing in your house, the defense lawyer is going to see that. On the other hand, if you have a house that looks like your Tori Spelling, the defense isn't going to be very impressed. So there are all sorts of parts of this. I don't like those background things because I think they're very distracting. As the person moves, they come and go. So I spend a huge amount of time on that, just working through it to try to get the best location for them, how they're going to look, what they're going to be. The mediator. I actually prefer to have mediators set up one-on-one calls with either side for about an hour before to talk through what some of the problems are going to be. It's not always possible. It is more often doable when you are utilizing some of the many fine mediators that are on this program, Jan, James, other people who are there, who are doing this and professionally. It's a little harder if you have a mandatory settlement conference with a judge doing it because they just don't have the time. And by that, I mean some of the settlement judges in the courts. But if you can do it, it's critical because you can explain to the mediator some of the background noise that is necessary. The mediator can get that, get an understanding of what's going on, get an understanding of the dynamic, because that never is going to occur, in my view, in a Zoom thing. It just doesn't happen. It sometimes can happen when you're over at the food place talking in the offices of ADR or the offices of Judicate West or the offices of JAMS, and I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings by not including one, but it ain't gonna happen on a Zoom meeting. So that to me is critical. If mediators do that, I look so much forward to it. I think it winds up being a much better mediation as a result. Where the camera is, understanding where the camera is, and the lawyer needs to do the same thing. The lawyer, just like the client, needs to get themselves prepared. I think briefs are far more important than they used to be when you're doing it by Zoom. Sometimes people kind of, throw the brief together. I think a brief that is provides great detail is far more important on a Zoom mediation than it was in the in-person ones. And food, something that nobody remembers. You got your client there for an entire day sometimes, and you have to remember they're going to get hungry. And if they're sitting in their house and you haven't made arrangements for them to eat at some point in time, it's going to fall apart. So to me, those are kind of the takeaways. I think I may have talked a little bit too long, so I'll let Jan weigh in.
Thanks, Gretchen. I actually learned a lot, and it was quite a different approach than what I expected to give or what I expected from you today. So let me just see if I can build on it a little bit. Jim, you asked Gretchen quite specifically how she prepared her client, and it was fascinating to me because I'm guessing that in my cases, nobody has spent 2 hours with their client preparing them. I do a different level of cases perhaps, but I just, my observation is nobody's spending 2 hours with them. So that's awesome. But what you didn't ask was about not what you didn't answer. You actually did answer this a little bit, but about preparing the mediator and preparing the opposing counsel. And those two components are also so important. They're important with every mediation, but they are, I think, particularly critical in Zoom because we aren't going to meet in the hall. Because if we don't get a chance to have that call, or if you don't return my call when I make it the day before, or if you're no longer at your office and I don't know how to reach you, then we don't know what the expectations are for the day. So I wanted to tell yet another story of a case that I had where I really thought that there was a missed opportunity because of the lack of preparation. As Gretchen said, this situation is evolving and rapidly, and really from industry to industry at any given day. We can't quite figure it out. I had a case, I think it was over the summer, maybe in June or July, and it was against a group home. And this group home had been hit by the coronavirus, so that they had a number of residents and staff members that had to leave the home, and a number of empty beds. And it was run by an older man who was in his 80s. He had been running it for about 35 years, and now his son was in on it. But this man, by the time they had the mediation, had coronavirus himself. There he is on camera. Thank goodness we weren't in the office at that one, right? But there he was on camera, and he was looking very ill, very gray. And the camera doesn't lie too much about your appearance. So I told Bouvier before we started, there is a button, that's a practical point, that you can improve your appearance. So always do that. But the point is that this was an evolving, emerging situation where the defendant was about to fold or maybe pass away. He did survive, but nonetheless, this was a whistleblower case. It was a long-term employee, a CNA, who was accused of taking opioid prescription medicine from the residents and giving them half a dose and keeping the other half. And there was an investigation that ensued when it came to their attention, and she refused to cooperate with the investigation, and so they fired her. They never could confirm that it was she that had taken the drugs, but nonetheless, she brought the action claiming that this was an old problem. Of course, they never had the problem again. But this was a kind of appealing case at the time, and the firm that had taken it was a firm that takes cases that gets multi-million-dollar verdicts. And so this was an associate, not the head trial lawyer that you hear about in the news. And he had the instructions not to move below 7 figures. He had communicated that to the defendant lawyer. The defendant's lawyer had communicated to him, my guy doesn't have insurance and the business itself is hurting, you're never going to collect that. And he said, let's go ahead with the mediation. What he hadn't communicated to either one of us is that he was never going below 7 figures for that mediation, and still hasn't. The case did not settle. It went back and forth. But here's where I say it was a missed opportunity and a failure of preparedness. This young woman had worked for this firm for about 15 years. She had a license to protect, which was not necessarily in jeopardy. They had not reported it because they hadn't substantiated it. But she couldn't understand what had happened and why she was being accused. Maybe she even thought she knew where those drugs went because she had reported it previously. And there were, problems with their licensing, and they were under investigation and scrutiny from the county that licenses them. And so there was really a missed opportunity, which I think both lawyers could have instructed their clients better to communicate what the heck happened here, and maybe even to understand one another, because she knew a lot about how the business was run, and maybe even cared for this old guy who had run the business and now was quite sick, and the business itself failing. So to me, there was a lack of preparedness maybe of the case. Maybe it wasn't ready to be settled. Maybe they hadn't investigated, but also a lack of, let's call it flexibility, or what do you call it when you can dance kind of quickly, moving back and forth, depth of adaptability, because things were evolving so quickly. And so, as I say, I think that the preparedness goes beyond the preparing your client for the camera. That's critical, and I love that you do it. But really preparing your clients for taking in new information, preparing your clients to show some flexibility, to show some empathy, to show up and earnestly communicate, and really preparing the opposing counsel for that too, instead of sort of shutting down. So in that one, first demand was 2.7 million. First offer was 5 or 10,000. Second demand was 2.7 million. second offer 30,000. I mean, I think they got up to 35,000, but there was never a counter. So, you know, you had to kind of give up at that point because there was no flexibility and no willingness to move off. It was just an opportunity to see how much they got. And that could have been done without the mediation, but not using the mediation properly, I think, was really the flaw in that one.
Right. Well, Gretchen, you touched on one aspect in your comments on that is really a good segue into the next topic, which you talked about the briefs and how important they were. And the next thing that we wanted to address was precisely the persuasiveness and advocacy in online mediation. And I know that in our preparatory talks, we've talked about the importance of civility, learning to listen, showing respect, and the absolute imperative to preserve the confidentiality of the mediation. But, you know, the persuasiveness goes directly to that brief point that you were making, Gretchen. So why don't you start with that? What are your recommendations from the litigator's perspective about how to use online mediation most effectively to be persuasive and to be a good advocate? You have to unmute.
Someone was saying my sound was good. It's not very good when it's muted.
All yours.
So one point I forgot to make. I did a Google search for tips for mediation on Zoom. There were 757,000 hits. So if somebody doesn't know how you can figure out how to do a Zoom mediation, there's a lot of information out there. But turning to the issue of persuasiveness, I thought a long time about this. I think it is fair to say, from my perception of Zoom mediations, it is far easier for clients to become hardened in their positions and more difficult for lawyers to, and control isn't the right word because it's the client's case. If the client doesn't want to settle it, it's not my job to say settle it. It's my job to recommend, and it's my job to talk them through the process. But I've been in a number of these where everybody gets pumped up on one side and gets stuck in a position. And I've had them actually go backwards, where there was a demand that was X, and suddenly the demand went higher. It's like, well, that's not helping here. Or it changed and it was modified in terms of some other aspect of the deal. And so that is, for mediators, I think on this program, that is the thing I think if there's a takeaway to get from this, it's that you need to recognize that it is sometimes harder for the lawyer to be able to handle the client in a Zoom context. I usually have set up, in addition to the Zoom breakout rooms and the Zoom whatever, I set up another independent means to communicate with the client outside of Zoom, whether it's just a telephone call or whether it's another WebEx program, or I don't, whatever. I don't know a lot about the technology, but I do know there's different ones, and I've been doing them back and forth so that I can kind of, outside of the context of the client simply feeling they are part of this Zoom thing that's on your, it's like Netflix, for Christ's sake, right? They're there. I'm there basically having a much franker conversation with them. I don't like doing the frank conversations in the breakout rooms. I think it's better somehow or other to do it independent, because somehow or other, by doing that, you break yourself away from the client feeling as if they're part of Netflix, and you get them in a much more controllable position. So that's for me with my client, but it's also something for the mediators to recognize. I think it is harder for the mediators in the Zoom context. And that is because you can't really have, even though you're in a breakout room, you're really never having those quiet meetings where you're just talking to the lawyers and the client's not there, which frequently happens. one possibility is you set up a separate breakout room. That sort of makes your client kind of feel like, what the heck's going on? I mean, normally these occur when you go out to the water cooler, right? The mediator says to you, hey, can I come have a conversation with just you, right? And your client sits there and reads their book or reads their whatever, the newspaper, and they don't seem to mind it. But if you're doing it in the context of a Zoom mediation, it's much harder. And so I recommend to mediators to think through alternatives for that, so that you can, in fact, have these frank conversations and find out what's happening on your side. Because the lawyer's sitting there, and the lawyer can't just say, oh, my client's being an idiot right now. So you have to kind of navigate your way through a much more difficult process. That means for me, I have to be more persuasive with my client. I actually find with Zoom, I need less, I don't feel as compelled to be so persuasive for the other side. I kind of feel as if it's me and my client and the mediator. And I don't really give a darn what's going on in the other room, except as it relates to how collectively we can come to a potential resolution that both sides are either unhappy about. That's one of those old adages that people use, or everybody's happy. I don't know. But that to me is, I don't know if that's helpful for you all, but that to me is what I perceive to be some of the difficulties of Zoom. I haven't found them to be positives on Zoom. And that's probably going to get to our last point, which we'll get to, and I'll make my views clear on that. But I think that those are all things that have to be taken into consideration. Everybody has to recognize them and set up other alternatives to be able to navigate through.
Great. Jan, from your perspective, what can our practitioners do to be more persuasive and to help on the preparation side?
So I agree with Gretchen. It's kind of remarkable that we're doing this webinar without ever having had a chance to meet and have lunch together or drinks or whatever and rehearse this, because we've been on lockdown since we've been planning this. But I agree that one of the biggest challenges is managing the dynamic between lawyer and client. For me, I always do, and this is, again, one of those things I've learned since March 23rd when I had that first one. I set up a breakout room that's called Jan Shaw's Mediation Office in every case. And I set up a room that's called Kitchen. And I tell the parties, listen, there's plenty of spaces. There's a space for you to talk alone with your lawyer. There's a space for a joint meeting with lawyers. There's a space in my office. There's a space in the kitchen. Just tell me what you want, and hopefully I can tell you what I want. We're going to do the best that we can to kind of move people around. But since I don't have a knock on the door, it's one of the limitations of Zoom. You got to just indulge me. I also think that's a tip and a kind of bonus to Zoom that maybe Gretchen doesn't appreciate or like, but I don't have to ask permission to bring somebody out. I just whiz them out and suddenly they're not on camera with their own client. So I set it up in advance so the client will be ticked off. I'm aware of the time so that I get back in there if I think there's a problem. But again, I wanted to share a story if I could, Jim, because it really illustrates the tension between lawyer and client. I had a case just last week, I didn't say that, recently, where it was a sex harassment, this one. It was a sexually hostile work environment by two employees of a chiropractor who was very flirtatious. And so she was looking for dates online, and she took these women who had been working for over 10 years. So she took them on vacations. She went to Las Vegas. She went on cruises with them, and probably crossed the boundaries of what we might consider professional behavior, dressing in, kind of sexy clothing and buying them sexy costumes, and ogling the patients and talking about their sex life on Mondays and what they had done over the weekends. And it kind of crossed a line. One of the receptionist, I guess, had been fired after 11 years for time fraud, for alleged fraudulent time cards. And the other one quit, and they went to a lawyer. And they went to a lawyer thinking that they had been wrongfully terminated, but the lawyer probably asked a lot of questions and said, oh my goodness, this sounds like a sexually hostile work environment. Trouble was that he was persuaded that he had enough to make a case. And again, a 7-figure case. He wanted, over $1 million. But the defense, being having retained counsel that sort of prides herself in specializing in frivolous lawsuits, did a ton of discovery and found, 10 years worth of text messages just gushing about what a wonderful employer this person was and how they so appreciated her taking them on all of these cruises, and not to worry that they'll find a boyfriend for her pretty soon. And, those kinds of consoling things that it was clear that these three were more like girlfriends than employer-employee. It was also clear to me that that's a problem when it's in the employment, in the workplace with an owner or manager. But I got this lawyer that was very distrustful. He was distrustful of the other side. He was distrustful of me because she recommended me over one of my colleagues who was much more expensive and booked up for longer time. She wanted to get it to mediation sooner. And so it really was a matter of persuading him that this was all legitimate. He also was distrustful of the confidentiality agreement. Once again, by the time the mediation came to me, there was no insurance, and the defendant had COVID, was recovering from COVID. But he even distrusted that. He said, Jen, how long is he going to continue? She going to continue with COVID? It's usually over in 2 weeks. I said, yeah, except those that die from it. This is a person that had been hospitalized for it. Like, just don't rush it. The person really does have COVID still. But it wasn't, it was a financial problem, and it was also a factual problem. I found that in that one, spending a whole lot of time with that plaintiff lawyer beforehand got him to trust me a little bit. And then he was willing to kind of step aside and let his clients take the camera. They were not particularly theatric. In fact, they were maybe honest to a fault, but they gave me enough that I could go and use my persuasiveness with the other side and say, this doesn't seem frivolous. These are points that I think are going to be detrimental. I don't think it's a nuisance value case. I don't think it's a 5-figure case. Let's see what we can do. And we continue to settle it, and did settle it in the low 6 figures. But the point is that the persuasiveness runs in lots of different circles. And you're right. And that's part of what we'll talk about next is the visuals, the acting, the theatrics do make a difference. But also, there are evolving dynamics. And I agree, it's kind of an interesting thing. I remember as a young lawyer, my first deposition when, I'm not telling you who, but I was at a big insurance defense firm, and the lawyer was actually kind of kicking the client under the table to answer differently in the deposition. I don't know if that still happens, but that ain't happening on Zoom. So it is a different dynamic, and one that needs to be managed, and one that needs to be managed carefully.
For sure. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the visual side. One thing that lawyers and their clients may not appreciate is the importance of putting your best foot forward, so to speak, on camera. Yet most of us are not accustomed to performing in front of a camera. As you all know, just from watching your favorite news anchors or actors on screen, it helps to know how to make the camera your friend. And Jan, I know you understand the importance of this. You even worked with a theatrical coach. So why don't you share a few minutes about that aspect of things, and then Gretchen will turn that part over to you as well.
So listen, you overstate when you say that I worked with a theatrical coach. I went once to Santa Fe, New Mexico for a workshop on speakers and presentation. The company's called Eloqui, Eloqui, and I love them. They are actors and teach speaking and presentation. It was many years ago. But when we first started Zoom, I reached out to them and was privileged to spend an hour on a Zoom call where they kind of gave me some context. So here's what I learned. First, wear blue. It is apparently an emblem of trustworthiness. So when I'm worried about it, I schlep out my blue jacket, and it is a good looking blue jacket. So there you have it. I also, one of the articles that I didn't attach in my materials for today, but I published in the Daily Journal, was called How Drawing Informs the Art of Mediation, because during our downtime, I took up a little art. And so I've been drawing in charcoal for quite a little while, and I've just switched to acrylic painting. But here's what I've learned about drawing and about how that informs it, is the background matters. So it conveys what I want to convey. My background, you can see this in my home office. So I have pictures of my kids. I have pretty artwork. I have a sofa behind me. And I don't have much clutter on my desk because I want people to feel more like they're at their therapist than at their law office. I want people to feel like they're the only thing in my life that day. And they are. So that's, you know, a little bit of background. In terms of perspective, and this is another thing you learn in art, but when you want somebody to really attend to you, you lean in. And sometimes when I want them to sort of pay attention to me, I stand up. When I'm this is a trick I learned from my colleague Ralph Williams. Never wear a jacket after lunch. Is it already after lunch? Well, not in my world. I haven't stopped for lunch yet. But you never wear a jacket. You actually roll up your sleeves so that you're making everybody understand you're at work now. This is hard work. But then at the end of the day, when I'm asking parties to make that hard decision about taking it or leaving it, when we've got to the last, best, and final, I do put my jacket on. Sometimes I button the jacket and I say, and I waltz in. Sometimes if I've taken my shoes off, which is not infrequent, I put my high heels back on and I walk back in and I say, congratulations, you did a great job. You got to exactly the place that we hoped at the very beginning of the day, which is the highest number that they'll get to today, or the lowest number they'll take, whichever I'm trying to sell. But the point is, this is it, folks. Do you want me to give you a minute? And then I waltz back out. But I do use the theatrics a little bit to the extent that I know it. Let me just touch on a couple of blunders, because in my painting, and I'm teaching myself painting, right? I watch YouTube tapes, and the YouTubes are usually famous blunders, like why every time you mix two colors, you get gray. That's my problem with painting. But blunders with mediating is touching your face, covering your face, as Gretchen said, pointing out your bald spot on the top of your head, eating during it. These are things that I would, caution all mediators and lawyers that are online not to do during. The cats, the kids, the occasional disruption, I find charming. I actually think it's endearing and a way to connect in ways that are very different from mediating in our law offices. You do want to do a sound check, and you want to make sure that you understand everything carefully before you leave the room, because sound can get garbled, things can get confused. You never, in my view, want to negotiate via text. Even after the mediation, if the mediation is still ongoing, you never want to get numbers and carry numbers by text. At the minimum, pick up the phone. Or if somebody's texted you to say, okay, we'll go to 25, you walk back in that break room before you move on. Those are just my ideas about the visuals of the presentation.
Gretchen, from what are your thoughts on this, and specifically, how, what protocols do you follow to try to be more persuasive when you're in front of a camera? And for the mediators that are on this webinar, what can they do differently in terms of visuals in your experience?
Wow, first off, Jan's suggestions were all terrific. I'm wearing black. I didn't wear blue. What did I know? Clearly. Um, I think my point on the visuals is that it is hard, and effort has to be put into it, contrary to what everybody expects, because we are always living in a three-dimensional world. And when we transfer to a two-dimensional world, we don't recognize that a lot of who we are is not coming across. So I think at the end of the day, everyone needs to spend more time working on it. That includes your clients, that includes the mediators. You know, Zoom is a wonderful thing. A little bit of it is dependent upon what kind of a device you're working on. If you're working on a small Dell computer, God love you, you're always going to be sitting up here staring to try to figure out how to mute or unmute yourself. I use a really large Mac. I think that's helpful. Sometimes that's not possible for clients. You have to recognize they may not have the ability to have a large Mac computer. I like Mac because Mac comes with a camera and a sound system, opposed to a PC that doesn't. Then you're out trying to buy something afterwards. So my plug for Apple is get an Apple device, because it's going to be better for you in the long run. In terms of how you come across visually, you have to come across as who you are. You have to come across as being honest, and sometimes that takes staring at the camera and just doing it on your own and practicing to make sure that you. I mean, the advantage of this is you see your picture, you're right there. So you ought to be able to take note. Okay, I'm seeing myself. How do I look? I don't like how I look on camera. I find myself to be sort of like, but you have to live with it. And so you need to be able to work with it. So I suppose my one tip is practice. It goes back to the old, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice.
Very good point. I just want to throw in one other thing here on the visual aspect of it. And this will be a segue into the where do we go from here part. But as long as we've got COVID, if we're in the same room with someone else, we're covered up like this, right? The one clear advantage of Zoom is that we can at least see each other's faces without obstruction. Okay. I think that's a very, very important point. It is very hard. And, Jan, you've written and spoken eloquently on this. How can you tell what my real feeling is when I'm buried behind layers of cloth here, right? I mean, yeah, your eyes tell you something, but they don't tell you the entire story. You can't tell whether I'm smiling, frowning, what's sticking my tongue out, right? I mean, we mustn't lose sight of that. And it's not to minimize, the very, legitimate points about the downside of doing it this way. But the upside to doing it this way right now is we can at least see that much of each other without that obstruction that you would, unfortunately still have to have for an in-person session. And that's true. For example, some lawyers have their clients meet with them in the same room and be on the same call. Well, then maybe you've got that and you're on Zoom, which is kind of the worst of two worlds. But I just thought that point should be emphasized a little bit. Go ahead, and then we'll segue. Yeah.
I would love to add something to that, because you've made a very, very prescient point. Again, it's two-dimensional, but your eyes and your mouth, more than any other aspect of you, reveal where you are. And I wound up having to get a new prescription for glasses. And I realized when I went to the optometrist that my prior glasses were small and you couldn't see my eyes. And I thought, I got to get bigger glasses. So I actually went to larger glasses, so that now even when you're out in the street or in the supermarket or, whatever, somebody has the ability to see your reaction in your eyes, as opposed to, because you can't see what's happening on your face. You're not seeing the smile. You're not seeing any of the wrinkles from the smile. maybe that's a good thing. But so for those of you who wear glasses, get larger glasses. What more can I say?
Well, that, go ahead, Jan. Yeah.
A lot of practical tips you folks are getting. It's too bad we can't see your reaction to them. So if I have already been asked, because I've had my first vaccine, whether I'm willing to take an in-person hearing. Our office is opening back up, and some people are willing to take that and some people not. So I had to really think about it and go, oh, I kind of have gotten used to this, working from my house in my slippers if I want to. And I won't have a good reason not to go into the office and do face-to-face. But here's my prediction. My prediction is that Zoom mediations, online dispute resolution, is here to stay. I think that there are certain cases that are never going to be welcomed as face-to-face. I think that cases in which, a lot of cases like I have, that are fraught with both emotional and sometimes even physical charge, they're afraid to confront one another. They're afraid to be in the same building. They're afraid to be in the elevator together. They're so nasty to one another, either the clients or sometimes the lawyers, that they don't really want to meet in the coffee room. Or the lawyers don't get along with their own clients and don't want to have to spend a full day with them. I think cases in where they're going to require travel are going to be cases that are going to have a preference for Zoom. So for those of you SCMA members that may be kind of mediation nerds as I am, just want to kind of take you back to the beginnings of mediation, which was in 1976. There were a series of conferences called the Pound Conference. And there, Professor Frank Sander from Harvard University talked about the concept of a multi-door courthouse. Oddly enough, in 2019, there was a repeat of the Pound Conference all over the world, talking about how do we reinvigorate ADR, because it had become a little bit ho-hum. And because many of us, particularly California, were called out for doing this, had dispensed with the face-to-face joint session altogether. There was a preference in our legal community to do everything separate. And so it morphed into something that was almost unrecognizable to the founding fathers of the movement of mediation, which started in the community setting and was an opportunity for communication back and forth and really facilitated dialogue in ways that litigated cases changed from. I think that one of the things that Zoom or online dispute resolution offers is, we'll call it that third side. So I hesitate to disagree with you, Gretchen, but I actually do think that it's in a way three-dimensional, in the sense that there's somebody watching those conversations. And William Ury, who is another founder of our movement of mediation, talked about, he wrote a book called The Third Side, which was originally published in 2000. If you haven't read it, you must. But he talked about enhanced civility and how people aren't acting as badly when they're on camera or when they're being observed. And that's part of the beauty of a neutral too, is that people are kind of on their best behavior, but I'd say even more so in the camera, because who are they performing for? Who are they beating their chest for? Their cat or their kid? Because mostly bad behavior happens in the office, but I haven't seen it so much in Zoom. So I have great hopes that this is a thing that's here to stay, not necessarily to the exclusion of face-to-face mediation, but I a little bit disagree with Gretchen in that I personally don't miss so much of that antagonism and that sort of showmanship for the sake of showmanship, because that's where you do that. People in their homes and in their offices by themselves seem to be kinder and gentler, and I think that's the way to go.
Gretchen, couple minutes into your crystal ball, so then we'll wrap this up.
Well, somebody in, what are we, January 2021, January of 2022 should call us all back together and figure out who won.
Yeah, exactly. We'll
Um,
have a lotto, right? Or, you know,
Right. So my personal view on it is this: humans are essentially herd animals. I mean, I have a lot of animals. Everybody knows this. I learn a lot from how you train a horse and how you train a dog. They love company. They don't like being alone. There are any number of articles you can read in the New York Times and the Washington Post on how the absence of even touching is causing great distress. So my prediction, we're going to be wearing masks for a fair amount of time. I have a dear friend, Kim Schreiner, who's the infectious disease expert over at Huntington. It's going to take a long time to get the vaccine rolled out, although probably the prediction is by July, virtually everyone will have had at least one shot. That one shot will probably provide immunity for you. There is going to, getting back to the word of a herd, we're going to get herd immunity. We're probably going to still wear masks. But by January of 2022, my prediction is that there will still be some Zoom mediations for maybe the odd case, the one-off. But at the end of the day, people are dying to get back together and be with people. And I don't perceive it persisting absent another pandemic, which
God forbid.
so that's my take on it. I love getting together with people. I've had lawyers who've called me out and screamed at me because I wouldn't come down below 7 figures. I still went out and had a drink with them afterwards.
Yeah.
I still have enjoyed a friendship with them. And yes, there are some lawyers who can be jerks. There are some clients who are jerks. They exist. They're not going away. But Zoom is not the solution to that. The solution is to come together. So maybe I'm taking a note from Joe Biden and some unity here, but my prediction is we'll be back in your offices and everybody's going to be paying rent again.
Thank you. Jan, I know you wanted to close with some
So
brief words of wisdom, and then we'll move into questions. We've got a few. Let me just interject before you do what I know you're going to do, which is very wonderful. That for any of you who need to leave because it's 1 o'clock, you know, Godspeed. We're delighted that you've been with us. I hope most of you can stick around for another 10 or 15 minutes because we do have some questions and they're good ones. And but Jan, you wanted to share something very special for us to close. So have at it.
Good segue, Gretchen, about Biden. And I agree with you. I miss my colleagues dearly, and I miss being with lawyers and at events and my friends. And I'm with you on all of that. But I do think that there's going to be a space that we've learned things since last March, and since that was kind of the topic of what we were charged to discuss, that's going to stick with us, and I think for the good. So I wanted to close with some words from our poet laureate, Amanda Gorman, who wrote The Hill We Climb. I'm not going to read the whole poem, but just some excerpts that really spoke to me as a mediator, and I hope that they'll speak to you a little bit too. She said, "We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And so we lift our gazes not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside. So while once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it."
Amazing words from a remarkable young woman who was a source of brilliant light at the inauguration. Just absolutely marvelous.
And by that, on that note, I don't know if anybody knows, she's one of two. She's a twin.
Twin.
her sister is equally accomplished and brilliant as a filmmaker.
I saw that.
So, I mean, she wowed us all. I think it's
And she's from Los Angeles and speaking all over town. So she's, kind of one of us now. Right.
We'll have to co-opt her, see if we can get her here for SCMA purposes. Well, look, with that, I would just want to say a few words of thanks, and then we're going to go into the questions period. Jan, Gretchen, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom this afternoon and for all of the hard work you've put in to prepare for today's program and for giving us different perspectives on what has become a very complex new reality. I want to thank Jan and Jennifer Toronto and Mark Lemke for their written materials that you all have. Thanks to the Attorney Outreach Committee, my co-chair Craig Lang, and our committee members Diana Kraus-Lehman, Jennifer Johnston Toronto, and Leslie Kushner. And to our new team at SCMA, we have a wonderful new director in Bouvier Yulin, delightful new administrative assistant Taisha Preston, and to Mark Lemke for his leadership as our new president here in 2021. I want to thank all of you for attending today. Don't sign off unless you don't want to hear any of these good questions and answers, but we hope this has enlightened you about the benefits and challenges of online mediation and where we'll be heading. You will be getting certificates of attendance and evaluation forms via email in the next few days. So please make sure you download the certificates of attendance, and please do give us your evaluation forms by return email. So with that, let me go to our questions. A few have come in here, and I'm going to start with one from Carol Aragon. Why doesn't the Zoom breakout feature provide the independence needed for private conversations? The other party cannot hear what's being said. Please explain and expand. Ladies?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Why does it provide the, what? Say it again.
Why isn't the breakout room feature adequate for providing the independence if a lawyer and a client want to have a private conversation?
I think, Gretchen, that's to you, because you mentioned that you weren't satisfied with that.
So here's the problem that I have with the breakout room. It happens with the mediators kind of, I mean, you can leave and you can join. I mean, there's any different number of ways of doing it. What I've found is, and I had this happen, the client got into the big room and was thinking, oh, I'm still in the breakout room, and just starts rattling off on something that was not something that we wanted said. So I kind of take the position that the breakout room will get stuck over in there and we'll talk about nothing about the case. And I talk about the case privately because I don't want to run the risk that suddenly they'll screw it up. So maybe it's that I have clients that aren't the brightest in the world, but it does provide that. I just think it's an added measure of security when you go to something else. Does that answer that question?
No. Jen, go ahead.
And I'll add, Jim, if I could, that I always ask the lawyers, either in that pre-mediation call or during the first session, whether they want to discuss things privately with me before they go in and talk to their client or not. And that way, if they choose, then I have them all day in a separate room. They can get work done, they can do whatever they want. They just talk to their client when either I put them in the breakout room or they're probably calling them and speaking to them on the phone in between. So it's not infrequent, it's not a very hard workaround.
Very good. Jan, there was a question based on your CNA case, and it really goes to whether it helps you as a mediator know the financial arrangement between the attorney and the client. The observation in this question from Donald O'Sullivan was, it sounds like the attorney may have been preventing the agreement, and it was more of a mediation between the attorneys rather than the plaintiff and the defendant. I mean, that's a broad topic, but let's limit it to this context. I mean, that kind of problem exists in presumably every case where you have some element of contingency at a minimum. But how's it different in the online setting? Has that changed in any way? Do you feel even more strongly you need some perspective as the mediator on that aspect of things?
I have to think about that for a minute. I don't think it does really change. I think in most of the cases, I know that the employment type cases, plaintiff is on a contingency fee and defendant is being paid hourly. I do ask when it's pertinent whether there's insurance and how the defense lawyer is being engaged. And if the defense lawyer is not being paid because of financial problems with their client, they let me know. So it doesn't stay a mystery for long, but it's obviously one of those delicate questions that you don't want to ask in a joint session or with the client, really, which is why you set up a room that's your own mediation office and a room that's a kitchen. And you just say, I mean, I make a little joke of it, a lie to me, you know, would you have a cup of coffee with me? Let's go in the kitchen. And then I move them right into the kitchen. And there we go with R. But usually I know, or they let me know in those pre-mediation calls.
Gretchen, what are your thoughts on that?
I think to me, the only issue that is probably the most significant in the cases that I have is to know, and usually you have an understanding of it, whether or not the policy is a wasting policy. And the dynamic changes on a wasting policy, in my view. And I think that it's critical that you have an understanding of that. On cases where there is no insurance, usually we've done the background work to figure out, you know, what the assets are. So going into the mediation, I usually have a pretty fair understanding of where things stand. My clients aren't usually at issue because we're always on a contingent fee. So it's not, that isn't a component for me.
Yeah. Since you're on, Gretchen, there was a question about why not just using text messaging is to communicate with clients. I mean, it's certainly for short things, it's good. I mean, I'm not a texter myself. I don't like it, but it can be, it would seem an effective way to get a private message to your client, or your client to say something to you that would be outside the Zoom context. Is that something you use?
I have, here's what text messages are. They're like emails. And, you know, for me as a plaintiff's lawyer, I got to tell you, I love getting people's text messages and emails from the other side, because you'd be shocked at what they are saying in there and what occurs in there. And so I'm very circumspect about what I ever put into a text message. And I think clients sometimes can be or cannot be. Really having a way to talk to them separately outside of the Zoom just provides a break from Zoom into the person that, I don't know, it's like, again, let me go back to horses. You know, you got a horse and you're having problems when you're having problems with them, right? You're trying to train them, you're trying to do it, and their mouth is tight, they're not listening to you. You got to get a break away from it. You got to take them out of what they're doing and put them into something else. And I think that to me is why I use it. It's almost like they broke outside of the mediation. Now we're privately talking separately. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how I perceive it.
Yeah. I mean,
I think there's
go ahead, Jen. Yeah.
Jim, I think there is something about kind of being on camera and being, you know, on the show in a way that, especially with the next generations, they're very comfortable doing everything on camera. They're, you know, they watch their shows and they get their news and they talk to one another, and it's all, you know, kind of fluid. I think there is something about breaking that trend and speaking directly and more casually in a on a telephone, but it becomes more and more foreign. Share with you that Jim and I were going to have a conversation yesterday, and so I sent him an email to say, can we talk today? And he said, yes, would you like to do it by Zoom? And I went, no, whatever for, I just want to have a telephone conversation. But you know, more and more, I think we're going to get used to this medium, and so we might as well figure out how to work with it instead of against it.
Right. There was a question, and apropos of what you were saying, Gretchen, I mean, one thing to keep in mind on the discovery front is that things that are occurring in the context of mediation are governed strictly by the confidentiality rules in the evidence code. And presumably anyone who's participating in a mediation has signed a confidentiality agreement saying what I refer to it as the Las Vegas principle: what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? So while I think, and you also have the attorney-client privilege aspect of it that would further impede any discoverability. But in a broader sense, you're spot on in terms of, boy, you can have a real treasure trove looking into someone's text messages, especially these people who just love to type on their phones rather than on a computer keyboard. I am not one of them, but just a couple more quick questions, and then we should probably let our friends go after a final word of thanks. Jan, the question was, what was the topic in Bill Urey's book that we should look out for?
Give me a second. Bill Urey's book is called The Third Side, and it's been many years since I read it first. But I remember it being a kind of principled basis for why mediation works, and why, I mean, I'll go off on a tangent, you'll never get me back, but why there should be a use of mediators in foreign relations, in government relations, in Washington, D.C., in the state of California, why the third side can offer options for facilitated dialogue that can calm everybody down and bring more civility into the room. I have it here, but it's been many years, so I can't give you the right chapter.
Just, I would observe that Professor Urey spoke at SCMA's annual conference a couple of years ago, and is one of the most inspiring speakers I've ever encountered in my life. He is just extraordinary in his wisdom, and even though he is not a lawyer, he is what, a sociologist, Jan? His insight into dispute resolution, particularly in high conflict cases, and he was doing international disputes and all that stuff, just remarkable. So he should be on everyone's must-read list, for great sources of wisdom in this field. Let me give you one more, and then we should probably sign off. We don't want to impose on people's time too long. What is your experience with highly emotional or high conflict disputes in the online context? Do those kinds of cases lend themselves more or less to online mediation? Gretchen, you want to take a stab at that?
I will, although I will say that Jan may be better at this. I don't do much employment law, and I will confess to you that I've always felt employment cases are similar to family law cases, because in the employee-employer context, since you spend so much time at your office, it's almost like your family. And I think we all know family law disputes can be very, very difficult. So I would suspect that it might fall into the category of what Jan said, which is that it can dissipate some of the nature of the charge or the highly charged conflict. But it doesn't, it's rare that I have that come up in the context of my cases. So I'd be hard pressed to give you any valid commentary.
Yeah. Jan?
I can answer, say there are limitations and there are benefits. So when I see somebody get highly emotional, I open it up. You see, I'm kind of therapist's office here. Talk to me. What's going on? You know, help me to understand. Wow, good for you for bringing this up. Good for you for standing up for your rights. And good for you for finding this lawyer that's passionate about standing up for your rights, because he's doing a great job too. So I can validate them just as I can in real life. I did have one case in the live since March where we were face to face but wore masks, and I couldn't deal with their emotions at all. And it didn't settle, and I was uncomfortable in my high heels, and I was ticked off that I exposed myself for a half-day case where everybody kind of dug in, and the reason that they wanted to do it was just to inconvenience one another because they were so angry about one another, you know, about how one another had conducted themselves. So I think there are opportunities. You got to learn to use the camera. And there are a couple things that I also neglected to say in the sort of nuts and bolts, but one of them is the beauty of the mute button. So when somebody gets really heated, I can mute them. When somebody gets obnoxious, I can leave the room, and I can have them leave the room. I'm in control in a way that I'm not necessarily when we're in the real. So yes, there's challenges in this medium, but once you know how to work them, there are workarounds that I think are equally useful.
Oh, that's great. And on the subject of high emotional cases, I will just remind everyone who's still on the call that next month on the 19th and 20th, SCMA is presenting its 4th annual Family Mediation Institute. So if you want to learn more about high conflict cases, February 19 and 20, just go on the SCMA website and sign up. It's going to be, we've got a great bunch of speakers and subjects to cover. And I think you'll learn a lot, even if you're not a family practitioner. If you have a practice that involves high conflict, high emotion type cases. So I commend that to you. We've imposed on everyone's time a good bit here. There were a couple of questions that were better asked, privately there, that I'll forward to each of you. They're not really pertinent to the subject matter today, but things that you might want to know about. And I'll forward those to you separately, Jan and Gretchen. Yeah.
If I could, I don't think you announced our email addresses, but I'm happy to field questions and be in touch with any of the audience that cares to with jfshaw@adrservices.com.
Okay, and Gretchen, how about you?
Sure, it's G Nelson at nflawfirm.com. You can find it on our website, Nelson and Franklin. So, and I think that's our website too.
Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, ladies, thank you so much once again. And thanks to all of you who've stayed with us. Hope this has been helpful. And stay safe, get vaccinated, and at least make the best of Zoom while we've got it. And, best of luck with your cases, whether you're mediating or the attorney for clients. Best of luck with your practices, and thanks to everybody. So
thank you very much for the invitation and for all of you for attending. And Gretchen, we'll see you back in January of 202022. We'll figure out whether that's going to be
we'll do a reprise. It's a deal.
Or whether it's going to be another Zoom call.
Exactly.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thanks everybody. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.